Hello, I'm Greg Cootsona, and welcome to On a Crash Course with the Old Testament. In these 10 weeks, you'll get an overview of the story, the overarching narrative of the Old Testament, so that you can find your story in God's story. You are invited to On a Crash Course with the Old Testament. So this is week 8 of On a Crash Course with the Old Testament. And we are looking tonight at the division and the rise of prophecy. So I'm going to start out with something you know I love, which is the Bible for Dummies. And I will go with how they describe an overview of what we're looking at tonight. So we're looking a lot at the book of First Kings and some of Second Kings, and then some of the prophets from the 8th century. And I love the way they put it. The books of Kings and then Chronicles, which repeats a lot of Kings and Samuels, continue the drama of ancient Israel's monarchy. At the conclusion of 2 Samuel, David is sitting on the throne as king over a unified nation. In addition, he has secured the location and supplies for God's house, quote unquote, the temple. At the beginning of 1 Kings, David successfully passes the throne to his son. We're going to see that in 1 Kings 2. You might have read it in preparation for tonight. At the beginning of 1 Kings, Solomon, who fulfills his father's dream of building the temple. Let's do that sentence again. At the beginning of 1 Kings, David successfully passes the throne to his son Solomon, who fulfills his father's dream of building the temple. What's more, Solomon surpasses his father's dreams by making Israel one of the wealthiest and most powerful nations in the world. But then things take a drastic turn for the worse. When Solomon dies, the kingdom splits into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. And Israel's the north and Judah's the south. After 2 centuries of political coups and spiritual conflict, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to the mighty Assyrian Empire in 721 BC. Less than 150 years later, the southern kingdom of Judah meets its end at the hands of the Babylonians, who conquer Jerusalem and destroy Solomon's temple in 586 BC. And if there's one second date I would encourage you to remember, just historically, because it's so important, is 586 BC. So the first one was 1000, approximately, when David started reigning as king, and then 586 is the end of the house of Jerusalem, meaning the temple, and the house of David as well. So with the death of Solomon in the late 10th century BC, so that's like, we're all in backwards here, right? It's like around 920, let's say. The kingdom of Israel is divided into north and the south, as I said, and the prophets become more urgent in their message. So we're going to go through a quick tour of the books of the Kings. I'll just give you some overview, and then maybe in our discussion, we can look at some of the passages in more detail. And then I'm going to move into the prophets of the 8th century. And so that's when the kingdom is splitting, right? In the 700s BC. And we may do more with that next week. I just don't want to spiel forever, as it were. So 1 Kings 2, right? David charges his son and gives him the throne. It starts out, when David's time to die drew near, he charged his son Solomon, saying, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong, be courageous, and keep the charge of your Lord, your God, and walk in his ways and commandments. Very similar, having now done this narrative of what the word is that Joshua, it's in the book of Joshua, right? And then we get Solomon, who we know to be wise, but doesn't always use his wisdom, right? So as we read these chapters, the questions in these first chapters of 1 Kings 2, 3, 5, 6, and 8 are, when did Solomon use his wisdom, and when did he make bad decisions, right? So it just shows that we may be given a gift, but we don't always use it well. And even though, so sometimes the really generalized statements in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, we just want to always recognize that doesn't mean that this person did everything perfectly with those statements. So in other words, that Solomon was given wisdom by God doesn't mean that, shouldn't imply that he was always wise. He made some bad decisions. And one of those is in 1 Kings 3, where he has, all these marriages. He makes a marriage alliance with Egypt. So remember, always with Israel, this in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, you always got to remember there's always a northern kingdom that's threatening and a southern kingdom. And they always go through what we call the Levant, right? This area that Israel's in. And they're always being overrun. And you're going to see that really come to a vengeance in the end of 2 Kings. So here, Solomon's trying to make a political alignment with Egypt by marrying Pharaoh's daughter, right? And he brings her into the city of David. But we see that is a problem, because then that brings in this worship of other gods besides the one God of Israel. Again, I'm just highlighting. We can definitely go back to these passages. But I did want to take a minute with this very famous passage of the wisdom of Solomon from 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 16 and following. So I will read it and just make some notes on it. And again, let's talk about it in our discussion time. So later, 2 women who were prostitutes came to the king, Solomon, and stood before him. The one woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. We were together. There was no one else with us in the house. Only the 2 of us were in the house. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your servant slept. She laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead. But when I looked at him close in the morning, clearly it was not the son I had born." But the other woman said, "No, the living son is mine, and the dead son is yours." The first one said, "No, the dead son is yours, and the living son is mine." And so they argued before the king. So just a comment, we saw that in the division of labor in Israel, the king didn't generally see disputes, legal disputes. This would be a civil legal dispute if we want to make that kind of distinction. But here, apparently he did it every once in a while, at least. And here he shows this famous wisdom. Verse 23, then the king said, "The one says, 'This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead.' And while the other says, 'Not so, your son is dead, while my son is the living one.' So the king said, 'Bring me a sword.' And they brought a sword before the king. The king said, 'Divide the living boy in 2, then give the half to the one and the half to the other.' But the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because compassion for her son burned within her, 'Please, my lord, give her the living boy. Certainly do not kill him.' The other said, 'It shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide it.' Then the king responded, 'Give the first woman the living boy. Do not kill him. She is his mother.' All Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice." So famous scene that I'm sure many of you know about, but if you didn't have it in your head, it would be hard for me to go through 1 Kings and not highlight that when we look at Solomon. So then you get these really important passages, which I think I'm just going to summarize in chapters 5 and 6 of 1 Kings, where Solomon builds the temple. So this is the house. Remember, we had this whole scene between David and God. God's going to build a house for David, meaning lineage. David should be building a house for God, and now his son's going to do it. So that's kind of a cool thing. I mean, I don't mean to diminish the importance of a temple for God, because I think that's really significant in a way that is hard for us to understand as Christians, perhaps, or as 21st century people. But temple's really incredibly important. At the same time, it is a fulfillment in a lineage of their their family, that the son is building and finishing the temple. And then, and this is, by the way, is the famous first temple. So we're going to see the first temple lasts from the period where Solomon builds it, approximately the middle of the 900s, till 586, when it's destroyed by the Babylonians. So the temple that Jesus knew was not the first temple. He knew the second temple. That was the rebuilt temple, different in size and scope. Also, by the way, just now I'm really gone on excursus, but also it was rebuilt by Herod. So it's almost like a temple 2.1 or something with Jesus, Anyway, so this is the first temple. It's being built. And then you see the Ark of the Covenant coming, which is really critical. the ark is brought into the temple, which I think I've mentioned before in the past classes, is the center of the Holy of Holies, is where the Ark of the Covenant was. And that would be considered the very, essence of the presence of God among the people. Maybe just let's read those last verses from chapter 9. Sorry, not last verses, but the verses that were the last part of our section 9, 1 Kings 9, starting at verse 1. When Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all Solomon desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time as he'd appeared to him at Gibeon. So God appearing is pretty important. It doesn't happen all the time. And whenever that happens in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it's a big moment. Just like when the Holy Spirit falls on people, that's a big moment. We confess as Christians that the Holy Spirit is present with us at all times, but in the Old Testament, the Spirit fell on people at different times. This is a kind of parallel experience when God appears. The Lord, and that would be Yahweh, that's what this, when you see the Lord again in lower caps, Yahweh said to Solomon, I have heard your prayer and your plea which you made before me. I have consecrated this house that you have built and put my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. As for you, if you walk before me as David, your father, walked with integrity of heart and of righteousness, doing according to all that I have commanded you and keeping my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. I'm going to put a little underline on that. As I promised your father David, saying, there shall never fail you a successor on the throne of Israel. All right, so this is what's going to create a crisis by the end of tonight, even in our reading. There will be no person on the throne by 586. So that's a significant problem that we're going to really look at next week a lot, is this whole experience of exile. So then we see more of Solomon's life in 1 Kings 10, 11, and 12. You have a visit from the Queen of Sheba, right? This famous Ethiopian queen. So you're seeing like the international expanse of Israel at this moment. And as I mentioned last week, whether it's just raw history of the providence of God, this was a period when the northern and southern powers were less powerful and gave Israel the ability to create a monarchy and also to expand in its work. And I don't know, this is probably not the most important thing about the Queen of Sheba, but I'm gonna do teacher privilege and just talk about this question of where is the Ark of the Covenant, because it comes in here. It's a really interesting question. So this is just a pull out fun moment. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred relic in ancient Israel, simply disappears without direct mention in the historical record. We know it moved from the tabernacle to Solomon's temple in about 960 BC, and we are fairly sure that it wasn't among the relics, which we're going to see later, taken by the Babylonians in 586. But here are some possibilities for where it went. Because Shishak, quote, took away everything, quote, from the temple. Some scholars and Steven Spielberg in Raiders of the Lost Ark theorized that he took the Ark into his capital city in the eastern Nile Delta of Egypt. That's one possibility. Possibility two, according to 2 Maccabees chapter 2 in the Apocrypha. So these are books that are in the Catholic Bible, but not in our Protestant Bible, nor were they in the Jewish canon of Scripture, by the way. The prophet Jeremiah hid the Ark and the covenant on Mount Nebo or Mount Sinai, the same place where Moses spies the promised land immediately before his death. Number three, the Talmud. So that's this record of Jewish oral tradition in the early centuries of AD. There's different by the way, it's like 300 or 400 years after Christ. The Talmud suggests that King Josiah of Judah hid the ark in one of the many storerooms beneath the temple of Jerusalem. That gives it a certain mystery. Still buried there, right? But here's the one I'm getting to with the Queen of Sheba. Many Ethiopian Christians believe that the ark resides today within the Church of Mary Zion in Aksum. This belief is based in the classic Ethiopian text that records that King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba had a son named Menelik, who brought the ark to Ethiopia. So if you go to this church, I'm told, as one of my friends told me, they'll tell you the ark's there. You can't see it, but they'll tell you that it's there. So that was your bonus buck for the day, right? It wasn't really related to what's going on.
No,
So,
that's great.
in verse back to Solomon, his many lives lead him to apostasy in 1 Kings 11. He dies in verse 43. And I wrote a note that Shlomo dies because, if I'm not mistaken, the word for Solomon in Hebrew is Shlomo. That was my own noting here. And then you have a fight over the power, right? Who's going to follow? And Rehoboam becomes the king of Judah, and Jeroboam becomes the king of Israel. So I'm going to show you a very small map. Maybe I'll go back because I have a bigger map there. So you see the map again on the right-hand side of the screen. The kingdom of Israel is the northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom is the kingdom of Judah. So as you can see, Jerusalem is housed in the southern kingdom. That's what was retained after the death of Solomon as, part of where the kings were, but there's also a separate king. Well, sorry, the kingdoms were separated. And then in 721, the northern kingdom falls to the northern conquerors, the Assyrians. So first of all, you have this divided kingdom, which I think is really significant. It took me many, many years before I realized this actually happened. And this already is in following right after Solomon. So there's only 3 kings where there's a united kingdom: Saul, David, and Solomon. All right, again, just continuing because we have a big section of scripture tonight. And I'm partly responsible for all these passages because I was part of the team that put it together. So there you have it. 1 Kings 17 through 19 and 21. Here we see the prophet Elijah and then his successor Elisha in the narrative of God's work with his people. So it's good always to think about what's his character, what's his personality, and how did he speak to the abuses of power in the day. So you see him taking on the prophets of Baal in chapter 18. And it's a very dramatic scene, which I'm not going to talk about much, but the power of Yahweh, the God of Israel, against the power of Baal or Baal, and how Elijah is able to invoke the power of God, of Yahweh in there. And then you see, Ahab's this northern king who's corrupt. He seems to be led by his wife in terms of the power structure, right? And Elijah doesn't seem to be too afraid of Ahab, but he definitely seems to be afraid of Jezebel. And so in chapter 19, he has this famous scene where he flees from her presence. Ahab, it says in first verse of chapter 19 in 1 Kings, Ahab told Jezebel, his wife, so King Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed the prophets with his sword. So not only is he calling down fire from heaven, but he's like killing the bad guys, right? Which I'm contrasting with what Jesus said should happen, because this is not Jesus's way, but it was part of the way that this prophet did things. Jezebel sent a messenger who said, quote, "So may the gods do to me and more also do if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." So in other words, she's saying, I'm going to kill you because you killed my people, right? Then he was afraid. He got up and fled, and he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. So it's out of the northern kingdom, right? He left his servant there. And he takes this really interesting, I don't know, can you call it a retreat? He's retreating from the enemy for sure. And he spends time and God ministers to him. And finally, you get this passage. I'm skipping over this great part in view of time in verse 9, second half. After this period where he's spending nights in a cave, the word of the Lord, the word of Yahweh, Dabar Adonai. That's this really famous, important phrase, the word of the Lord. Like it's the word that created the world, right? It's that powerful. Comes to Elijah. What are you doing here, Elijah? He answered, and I think we want to hear a whine in this point, right? I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altar, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life and take it away. God said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. And this famous scene, I remember when I was in seminary, we had a speech class which helped us understand how to read scripture and stuff like that. And they're like, read this passage and really think it through what's happening. And I'm not saying that I'm going to do it justice, but just feel this one. So he goes out. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before Yahweh. But Yahweh was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after that, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in the mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And there he came out and then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answers again the same refrain, like, "I've been very zealous. Everybody's beating up on me. That's not fair." And apparently that doesn't always work with God. Sometimes God comforts us. Sometimes God says it's time to get moving. And here's one of those moments. "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also, you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel." That's the northern kingdom. "And you shall anoint Elisha," so like a follower, "as prophet in your place. And I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." So again, it would be really fun to talk about what's happening here in that passage. But I would pull away that God hears Elijah, ministers to him, but doesn't just leave him in some kind of comforting little beanbag chair or something. You know what I mean? With a fern over him. I'm thinking now 1970s, right? But gives him a command to go out. I want to read just a couple more passages. And I think I'm not going to go to the prophets tonight, just to view the time, although we can certainly talk about them, the last people we had in our reading. So I really think we need to take in chapter 21 because it relates to the economic system of Israel. And I think it's important for us to understand this because it's different from our economic system. The economic system of Israel was based on land that had been given to families. So all of the land, all of the wealth was in the land. They were, at this point, Jews were farmers. We don't often think of the Jewish people as farmers. It's because the Jews that we know have gone through years of persecution where all their land was stolen from them, right? That's so that we don't think of Jews as farmers. The Jews became traders and bankers and so on, right? That's the tradition of the Middle Ages and so on. We could talk about Jewish persecution, anti-Semitism, but that's why that happened. But in this day, the money was in the land. And the land was distributed to the families, and that was like their land. You don't take the land. And so like in the Jubilee, it's a restoration of the land that had been under debt to the families to which it originally belonged. But that's here, it's important to take in that a poor person had a right to his land no matter how powerful the other person was. So Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel beside the palace of King Ahab of Samaria. So we're back to Ahab again. And Ahab had said to Naboth, "Give me your vineyard that I may have it for my vegetable garden, because it is so near my house. I will give you a better vineyard for it. If it seems good to you, I'll give you the value in money." But Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid that I should give you my ancestral inheritance," right? So this is the key. This is his family's land. Ahab went and became resentful and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him. For he said, "I will not give you my ancestral inheritance." He lay down on his bed, turned away his face, and would not eat. He's pouting. And then here comes Jezebel, right? His wife Jezebel came to him and said, "Why are you so depressed that you will not eat?" He said to her, "Because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, 'Give me your vineyard for money, or else if you prefer, I'll give you another vineyard.' But he answered, 'I will not give you my vineyard.'" His wife said, "Do you not govern Israel?" This is the rule. This is the way the golden rule is sometimes stated. The one with the gold rules, right? "Get up, eat some food, be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." So she wrote letters. She says, "Proclaim a fast, seat Naboth at the head of the table." So proclaim a fast, seat Naboth at the head of the table and the assembly, Send two scoundrels opposite him and have them bring a charge against him, saying, you have cursed God and the king. Then take him and stone him to death. So to curse God and the king was a punishable offense by death. So she's creating false witnesses, right? Again, breaking a commandment, although I don't think she cared much about commandments. The men of the city and elders of the nobles who lived in the city did as Jezebel had said words to them. And then as it goes, of course, Naboth is killed. They took him outside the city and stoned him to death. They said to Jezebel, Naboth has been stoned. He is dead. So, we don't get how terrible this story is. It's very similar to what David did. Because of power, you're taking things that aren't supposed to be yours. Even no matter how much power you have, this is wrong. And this is to me, this is the beauty of the Bible. Honestly, we don't have a book that enthrones might makes right. We have a book that enthrones what we like to call in the United States a rule of law, but even more deeply, that is based on the Torah. So if you think about, I forget if I did this before, if you think about the way the Hebrew Bible is arranged, the center of the Bible is the first 5 books of the Torah. Outside of that are the prophets. They look into Torah, and then outside of that are the writings, with books like Psalms and Proverbs and so on. So it's everything's supposed to look back to Torah, to the instruction, the law of God. I mean, again, law is such a weak word for us. We think of law as a negative thing. It's thought of as a positive thing. It's thought of, this guides me. Your word, O Lord, is a lamp unto my feet. Your law, O Lord, essentially, and a light to my path. That's what law was. So that's a good thing. We don't violate it. We don't kill somebody and give false witness. All right. I'll go into 2 Kings, and as I said, I'll bracket the other prophets for tonight since we have probably too many passages. Let me just say there's a fantastic, amazing passage in 2 Kings 5 where Naaman, a foreigner, is healed. Jesus loves this passage, so we should love it. I'll just summarize the takeaways that God is the God of all the nations. We just prayed that before we started tonight in Psalm 82. God is a God who cares about suffering, and God is not just a God of the Israelites. We already see that in this the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. But I want to also, we skipped in our reading the great reform of Josiah, where the book of the law apparently had been lost, for goodness sake, and apparently literally, and Josiah recovers it and brings the people back to this book. He reigned from about 640 to 609. But the final chapters are significant and important. I'm going to lean on my buddies in the Bible for Dummies just to close up, and then again we can talk about all these passages. This is 2 Kings 23 through 25. There's this ongoing problem because the kings are trying to decide who's more powerful. Is it the south, the north, meaning the Egyptians or the Babylonians, and who's going to win? And there's this great battle at Carchemish where the Egyptians beat the Babylonians way up north of Israel, and they come to ascend, but there's an alliance that's made with Egypt. So the king's just trying to figure out, you're this small country, between these two big countries. I mean, obviously we're seeing this happen when a somewhat smaller country is facing off a bigger country, right? So Ukraine, I think it's around, I believe it's 30 to 50 million, and Russia's 150 million. So it's smaller. I mean, Israel's tiny compared to that, right? Compared to these huge countries. Anyway, they're trying to figure out, do you make alliances? Do you just admit that they're bigger countries that are going to overrun you? How do you do this? What's faithfulness? Boy, it's just not easy to figure out. So I'm going to let, as I said, the Bible for Dummies wrap this up. The end of an era, the fall of Jerusalem. That means Messiah is on the throne. Jerusalem, the capital, is established, the city of David. There is the temple where God can be worshipped and where Torah is upheld. Those things are in place. The things that were promised all the way back to Abraham, right? Following Josiah, many of them were promised to Abraham. Following Josiah's death in 609, the kingdom of Judah becomes a pawn amidst the mega powers of Egypt and Babylon. First, the Egyptian pharaoh Necho imprisons Josiah's son Jehoahaz and places another of Josiah's sons, Jehoiakim, on the throne of Egypt's vassal. Egypt, however, gradually loses power as Babylon, led by their king Nebuchadnezzar, gains strength through conquest. And this, again, this famous battle of Carchemish up north of Israel. It's really important. I think it's 605. Eventually, the Babylonian army approaches Jerusalem, and Joachim, seeing there's an N Kai coming, seeing Jehoiakim, this is Jehoiakim with an M, seeing the writing on the wall, switches alliances. Not a good idea, right? This arrangement lasts for 3 years, but when Nebuchadnezzar retreats after failing in his attempt to invade Egypt, Jehoiakim rebels. In response, Nebuchadnezzar attacks Jerusalem in 598 BC, and Joachim dies during the struggle. Jerusalem's days are numbered. 2 Kings 23 through 25, that's the last part we read. Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiakim, with an N, is only 18. Some freshman at Chico State, imagine that. Nothing against Chico State freshmen, but a young kid, right? When he ascends to the throne, that's how Jehoiakim, however, he rules for just 3 months before Nebuchadnezzar besieges Jerusalem, forcing the king to surrender. Although Nebuchadnezzar spares the city from destruction, Jehoiakim, along with his family and officials, are carried off to Babylon. So Babylon, is Iraq, right? Iraq. I should know that offhand, just like that. Anyway, my brain was having a moment. So Jehoiakim is carried off to Iraq, what we call Iraq today, along with his family and officials. The Bible records that at this time, 10,000 captors are exiled, and, quote, none remain except the poorest in the land, and of, quote, 2 Kings 24:14. The next decade is full of famine. It hasn't ended yet, though. Nebuchadnezzar puts Jehoiakim's uncle Zedekiah on the throne. Ultimately, however, and we can decide why he does this, Zedekiah revolts, and Babylon responds with vengeance. In 787 BC, the Babylonian forces besiege Israel, while Jerusalem's walls hold off the invading army for 18 months, which is pretty amazing, right? Inside the city, things are falling apart as famine and starvation becomes widespread. Numerous atrocities occurred during this period, including parents eating their own children in order to stay alive. Finally, in July 586 BC, again, this very important date, Jerusalem's walls are breached. Zedekiah tries to escape, but is captured. As punishment for his rebellion, the Babylonians, who aren't very nice people, that's my added addition, they kill his children before his eyes, if you can imagine that, and then gouge out his eyes so that the death of his offspring is the last thing he sees. And he's led away, Zedekiah, in chains to Babylon. Within the next 2 months, Nebuchadnezzar implements another deportation of the population, and Jerusalem is destroyed, including the fortification and, most importantly, God's temple. For nearly 4 centuries, God's temple stood in Jerusalem at the center of Israelite worship, a religion symbolizing its enduring strength. Now it is gone, with no indication that it will ever stand again. So I don't know if this is new for you, but I remember when I first really took in how devastating this is, this exile. It was really something different to read Psalm 137 again. So if you want to open it up, you can. You don't have to. You can just listen. This is now in exile. People have been taken to Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our harps, for there our captors ask us for songs, and our tormentors ask us for mirth, saying, sing us one of those songs of Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. And it's this exile that is somewhat mitigated, as we'll see, when the temple's rebuilt and the people return. But at that sense of exile that I think it's true to say Jesus entered into his ministry in. The Jews always felt after this that they were exiled because they never had a Jewish king again, a Messiah on the throne. They were always an occupied country.